Right.
But how is that for, is there an alarm? Should I wait? Can you see it?
I don't see anything. No.
Oh. Have you been born in Palo Alto?
No. Born in Montana, born and raised in Montana, which has 11 different Indian tribes, one of them a landless tribe, in the city, not in the country, in the city of Great Falls, Montana, which is east of the Rocky Mountains, east of the Divide. So much of my upbringing was fishing and hunting and relating to the Indian culture there. I lived on the south side of town in a working class neighborhood, and one of my best friends was Indian, although she was not from a local tribe. She had been adopted. And the city also had an Air Force base at Malmstrom Air Force Base. And so there were African Americans who lived in my community, not very many, but it was the exposure to these folks that made me curious about difference. So for a long time, I was interested in people of color, Indigenous peoples. And my work at the university was teaching mainly white folks to unlearn their racism and white privilege and other forms of discrimination.
How did you get to Palo Alto?
Well, it was a long and circuitous route. I was initially going to Uganda, East Africa with my husband for 3 years. And at the last moment, they decided that maybe he was too questioning and they were interested in gathering information from the Uganda students. So we were told that he had to do his army service and therefore we were put off. And so we eventually came out to California and I received a scholarship to go to Stanford University. And I just stayed. We stayed. It was a very mixed time because I came from a working class background. I really was not very interested in high school. It was boring. And I actually got a job as a telephone operator while I was in high school, working 4 hours at night after school every day and then 8 hours on the weekends. So schooling was far less important than the work that I was doing. But a couple of my teachers said, look, Roberta, you know, you're kind of wasting your time here. Why don't you get a little bit serious about some of this? So when I went to Stanford, I was overwhelmed by, first of all, the brilliance of the students, the competitiveness. At that time, 1 out of 4 students was a woman, the beautiful faces, very white dominant student body. And we would maybe go to the beach for the weekend if we had a vacation. But most of these people went off, they flew off to Hawaii or to Europe or whatever. So I learned about my class background and how difficult it was to be working class in a upper class university. Even though the student population is somewhat different, there still is a very white dominant male population there, and it's extremely competitive. I really had to work my tail off to kind of catch up because I hadn't really paid much attention in high school. So it was a challenging time. I think I learned how to be critical, a critical, constructive, critical thinker there because some of my so-called taken for granted assumptions were far more accurate than some of the things that professors and others would state. I taught high school for a while and then I finished my doctorate and went to teach at San Jose State in the College of Education. And that's where I taught critical issues in education and multicultural education, which was a course, a required course and still is for prospective teachers and graduate students in education.
Was the whole of catalog of influence for you?
Oh, yes, very much so. In fact, I have an original copy of it in my library. At that time, I was involved in the counterculture movement, the anti-war movement. I went up to San Francisco to the Haight and to Golden Gate Park. And Stuart Brand was documenting all of this work, the music, the counterculture, the Black Panthers. I mean, it was an amazing period of time. I think so rich in so many ways. And his efforts to catalog that and to also address the status of the earth and the environment in general was a piece of it. I was part of a group called the Free University in Palo Alto, and Brant was around this area selling these at one time, and I picked one up at that time. So it was a very popular book. So I have to take a look again. I know where it is.
But there are a lot of books for mail order in there. Did you
Yes,
also order something at some point?
I did at the time. Yes. I mean, it's just like an encyclopedia of things people can have access to as alternatives to the mainstream white stream world in which we live.
Were the early tech people, they were hippies or weren't they?
Not really. They were somewhat counterculture, but as the high tech companies began to expand and make more money, they became less engaged liberals and more conservative in their politics. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, they were far more into making lots of money than counterculture. One major aspect of that was there were people who lived in what were called communes, large houses which were turned into places where communities lived together, and they pooled their interests and they shared their food. Another aspect of that in Palo Alto was something called the Free University, which was a place where we would host free seminars. Like I would do a seminar on the counterculture of Bob Dylan and the influence of his life and music on people. There were all kinds of experiments with legal and illegal drugs. A lot of people would go up to the city for weekend concerts, or we would have concerts in the park here. Anti-war demonstrations were part of that counterculture hippie movement.
Okay, and were the tech people part of that or not at all?
Not very much, no. I would say the majority were not. Steve Jobs, for instance, who was an Apple, developer, he had a liberal but not a very pro-hippie perspective. Liberal but not to the edges of the counterculture, which was so-called hippie, which is probably not a great term for that movement. But it was an amazing movement of people who said we can do better, we can make a better world. And money isn't the only thing that runs a country, that people getting together and serving each other. In the city, there was a free health clinic.
With the city, you mean San Francisco, right?
Yes, yeah, in San Francisco. In the Haight, especially, there were blossoming groups of people wanting a different kind of world. And that spread out beyond the city to a large part of the country, and particularly to California.
How would you define a hippie in the 70s?
People who were, they wouldn't have probably said this at the time, but who were challenging capitalism, deciding that money wasn't the most important part of one's life, that material possessions were transient, that there were alternative ways of living and learning and loving. Later, I think it became more consciously anti-capitalist. Yeah, that work wasn't the major force in the world, that relating to people and living a meaningful life did not necessarily include working yourself to death and then getting your salary and then going home or going on a vacation. That there was a lot more to life than that. And creativity and music and invention, writing and sharing were so much more valued than working for money.
And it's interesting the word you use now, sharing, because Mark Zuckerberg would would like say, yeah, sharing is very important, right?
Right.
Now you're laughing. Why?
Well, because Zuckerberg speaks out of both sides and many sides of his mouth. He's really much more into it for the money than just about anything else, sharing the money with his coworkers and high-tech friends. Sharing ideas in order to make a profit.
Okay.
It's very profit driven.
Do you see any of the hippie values come to life nowadays?
No, I don't. I see the corporate world making things significantly more unequal. I see much more poverty and homelessness. Much, and with this COVID, it's gotten even worse. There are people who, for instance, the other night, a woman and I, she's on the low income housing committee, went to bring some food and organic fruit to an 80-year-old woman who's living in her car behind a church, in a parking lot behind a church. There's little support for such women. I mean, she's 80 years old, she has a cat. She's been evicted from her housing and she can't find anything that, and her car is filled with all of her belongings. So we kind of reached out to try and find out if we could get some plastic bins so that she could put some of the stuff from her car inside these bins outside the car, which is something we're helping her do. But this is just one tiny example of thousands of people, thousands of people who are homeless. There's a film about the homeless in Hawaii. Hawaii has the largest homeless population as a state. I think it's called Homeless in Paradise. The homeless here in Palo Alto are far more hidden. I mean, behind a building or under the bridges. In Hawaii, they're not hidden at all. They're on the streets in tents and much more visible. So I don't see an opening yet. Perhaps like in San Francisco, they are attempting to house some of the homeless in motels, but they only had done that for a small period of time. And now these people are, some of them are back out on the streets. So it's a back and forth, and I don't know whether the governor or the president is going to be able to really seriously take on this gross inequality of wealth and poverty. But that's our hope, and that's what we're working for.
So this is the demonstration where I met you.
Yes,
These
this is
are
Ruth and Judy, and Ruth has moved to a senior center. And unfortunately, the senior center that she has moved to doesn't like her politics, doesn't like her talking about climate change and anti-nuclear issues and so on. So she's and her husband have kind of had an awakening about the fact that there are some places where it's difficult to speak out about your politics. It was a shock, even in the Bay Area, that this place was so full of people who thought Trump was a great guy.
you address all the major problems at the moment, right? With your
Yes, yes.
demonstrations. So climate change is real, love your Mother Earth, and save Medicare now.
In about a half an hour, there is going to be another regular vigil at this same place, Town and Country Shopping Center. I won't be there, of course, but people will be there again talking about Medicare for all and supporting homeless people. They have tried to basically ban people in their vehicles from parking on the streets, and we have protested this and filed a suit, finally, a group in Southern California, that it was illegal to keep people from sleeping in their cars. So we're working on trying to get some parking spaces. And the city of Palo Alto has been very reticent to do anything to serve the homeless. They finally begrudgingly gave us 10 parking spots on the edge of town, but this has been after a battle to get a lot more parking than 10 spots.
And this
Oh,
is you?
yeah.
Love your Mother Earth and uniting to end poverty, racism, militarism, ecological devastation. Peninsula Palo Alto Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And the Poor People's Campaign is a national thing. It's not just in California.
That's right. And we're connected with it and support it. And Reverend Barber actually came here to Stanford and spoke, not this winter, but the winter before in December. And we had a short meeting with him. And we do what we can. Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is an international organization, been around for over 100 years. People on the East Coast, West Coast, and around the world are aware of Reverend Barber's Poor People's Campaign. We focus on several groups, several issues, like the last demonstration we had was primarily anti-nuclear, and people went to the Livermore lab where there are nuclear bombs being built. Several people were arrested there. We had 4 or 5 different groups supporting our demonstration on the corner of El Camino and Embarcadero, the 22nd of January was an anti-nuclear day, but each week we focus on a little different issue. Sometimes it's multiple issues.
So the Embarcadero is a very important road.
It's the entrance to Stanford University, yes.
The other road is El Camino Real.
A major throughway from, San Jose to San Francisco.
Sometimes cars were honking.
We have signs encouraging them to honk, honk for Medicare, honk for help for the homeless. Sometimes we're a small group of 3 or 6 or 10. Sometimes we're a much larger group. It really depends on how broad our reach is and how free people are on a Friday at noon to come and join us.
So, and here we see the Town and Country Village. So this is basically really next to a big shopping center.
It's a pretty upscale shopping center for Stanford and the Palo Alto community. Lots of restaurants, pretty upscale for the most part. But there's also a few, pharmacies and so on.
So you are demonstrating in Palo Alto since the 70s, right?
Yeah, since late 60s. And also in the anti-war movement, I was involved. When I was at Stanford, I also was involved in the anti-war movement there. I ran for city council on a rent control campaign, and I wanted to show you, I found, this is just happenstance, I haven't seen this poster in years and it's falling apart, but I want to show you, and I'm going to take the computer over and show you let's see, how can I do that? I can get up here and show you this. My name then was Roberta Kane. I have since taken my maiden name back and been divorced, but can you see it says keep on I love this sign. Connie Veraldi made this sign. We had them all over town. Keep on trucking for Roberta Kane for City Council, Palo Alto City Council, May 1. This was in, I think, 1970. We, of course, lost. And since there's never been any rent control, but we keep trying, and we did some good things and got some traction from the city. At one point, we claimed, and I think it was accurate, that Stanford and the powers that be in the city wanted to have Palo Alto be the Wall Street of the West, if you will. They were advocating for tall buildings. One was actually built 15, 20, 30, I don't know what it is, maybe I should check that out. Anyway, we have one semi-skyscraper sort of building in the city, but nothing else since. The city council was in 1970, and we tried to keep this affordable housing on the block in 1969, and that triggered the need for what we felt was an advocacy group for tenants' rights and for rent control.
So already in the 70s, rent control and housing was a problem in Palo Alto and the Bay Area?
Yes. Yeah.
Why?
Because the council was comprised primarily of people who were supported by office developers. And Stanford was interested in expanding office development. And clearly it's cheaper to build office and get more money from offices than especially from affordable housing. So it's very hard to live in Palo Alto. And sometimes I say, it's like banging against a metal door that will never open.
If you would be mayor of Palo Alto, what would you do?
Well, I'd first inventory the city as to how many people are supportive of changing the city into a more diverse community, which it is not. It's really an elite, predominantly white, although rich Chinese have come into the community and have some power and influence. I think I would start an educational campaign and a social justice campaign to help people understand how limited and inferior the city is without the kind of diversity that we need. And I would work to try and educate people about East Palo Alto, which is separated really by a freeway from Palo Alto and is a much more ethnically diverse and seriously poverty-stricken community. In Palo Alto, 1 out of 20 or 25 people have been inflicted with the COVID. And in East Palo Alto, 1 out of 6 people. I would try to work to change that with people by education and social justice issues and so on. We had a woman lawyer, Rebecca Eisenberg, who is very progressive and who ran for city council. I think she got 5 or 6,000 votes, but you had to get 10 or 12,000 to win. So she did not have a chance. But she and a small group of us continue to pressure the council at council meetings and the Human Rights Relations Commission to try and get them to see the light. It's like really walking uphill for sure, but we haven't stopped. Also, we have a police force that is very uneducated and somewhat racist, and we've been trying to take them to task, and some of them take them to court for the abuses of their power in arresting ethnically diverse people who either live in the city or come into the city.
It would be very easy for these big companies just to build housing, affordable housing, just to give money to people who are not so wealthy and who are really struggling.
There are a few who do this, but not enough to make a difference. There's a guy by the name of Sobrato who claims he's done a lot for East Palo Alto in terms of a clinic and housing support and so on, but it's not enough, and there aren't enough of them who are committed to doing this. Once people get a taste for greed, they seem to become intoxicated by it. And there's never enough. I mean, look at the people at the top, billionaires who could, I mean, even, just Bezos, he could fund housing for the world. He could do so much with his billions, and he's pretty tight gripped with most of his money.
There is even a newspaper. You have this Palo Alto Weekly and Palo Alto Daily newspaper.
Interestingly enough, the Palo Alto Daily and the Weekly have replaced the Palo Alto Times, which went out of business some 10 years ago. We also have a big paper in San Jose, the Mercury. The Palo Alto Daily and the Palo Alto Weekly are funded almost entirely by real estate interests, by the real estate industry. There are pages of expensive $2 million houses for sale. That supports this free weekly and daily paper. And we don't have an independent paper any longer. These two papers have replaced it, and they're pretty biased towards the Chamber of Commerce and the commercial district and the big real estate interests here, full of ads. That supplies the salaries for the people who work there. The Daily has a more libertarian bent, and the Weekly is kind of pseudo-liberal, pseudo kind of middle of the road. But basically, they support the high-income housing and high-tech community.
You immediately think about the song from the 60s, but then it's just because it's on California Avenue, right?
Right. Yes.
How did you experience the change, the modern times coming to Silicon Valley? How did Palo Alto change?
In my own neighborhood, which was somewhat multi-ethnic, my daughter played with 4 Navajo Indian kids who lived next door on one side and 2 African-American kids on the other side. Since this high-tech invasion, that housing has been destroyed and replaced by either condos or upper income houses, or in the case of my next door neighbors, it was replaced by 3.5-story office building, which housed at one time psychiatrists, social workers in little rooms at maybe $2,000 a month, very small rooms. Then they attempted to want to replace this 3-story building with big parking lot, with huge number, 5-story, huge number of condos. And the neighborhood and the people in the building fought against this. It was a massive increase in space and way overbuilt for the lot, which was a big corner lot. So that was rejected by a lot of organization. We worked very hard to keep that back. But the people who fought against it being built, many of the doctors, psychiatrists, social workers, who were paying only $2,000, $2,500 a month for rent in these little rooms, were kicked out by rent increases from $5,000 to $10,000 per room. And now those people have been totally wiped out of that space, and the space has been changed so that there are maybe 10 high-tech companies there. And one high-tech company, which is in a space probably of maybe 25 feet long by 15 feet wide, pays $70,000 a month for the rent. Imagine, this is 1/5 of the building, or 1/8 of the building. And now with the COVID, a lot of people are not going into their offices, they're working at home. So I don't know what the status of the rents are over there. I really haven't asked, but that was the first thing that happened. Low-income housing was being torn down. High-income housing and office development took over way more than it should have for the housing that was available. Most of the people who work in Palo Alto cannot afford to live here. The housing is so expensive, and that's the big change.
The buses, right? They take the workers to.
They take them to work. Actually, that's in front of Palantir, I believe. And those buses pick people up all over the county and bring them to work. Now with the COVID, some of the small shops in downtown Palo Alto have been forced to close down. So it's hurt the small service industry, the small shops like manicure shops and barber shops. Many of them have gone out of business.
One of my series was about people going to work in the morning. So I watched the people leaving the Caltrain, and I sometimes followed them, and I took a lot of photos. And so this is interesting for me, this photo, because you on the left side, you have the people who build the infrastructure of Palo Alto, and on the right side, you have the tech people, right?
The inequality is also very pronounced at this point in time. And even some of the workers who work in the high-tech industry have purchased RVs because they would rather have an RV than pay $2,000, $3,000 in rent. Mountain View has many more because Mountain View is less restrictive. Palo Alto doesn't want these funny looking places on their streets. So they're limited to, for instance, El Camino, which is a commercial street. They don't want them in the neighborhoods. They banned them in neighborhoods in Palo Alto for the most part. And now they're doing that to a certain extent in Mountain View as well.
And I was really shocked that even kids live in there, children.
Families, you bet, whole families.
What do you think about that photo?
There are a lot of shrubs in Palo Alto. Place for somebody to tuck under and sleep, maybe.
Actually, this is the parking lot from Palantir. There is a very small written Palantir on there.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, by hand, you know.
They also don't let you know that they're there. There is no big sign saying Palantir. There is no sign on Amazon, which is a block away. Who knows who's in that big building, a brand new building they don't actually want people to know who's there because they know they're not as welcome as they might be.
I think Palantir is moving, right?
Yes, they're leaving Palo Alto, which we're happy about because they took up a lot of housing space. They could afford it, and a lot of the low-income folks were forced to travel a great distance to get to work there as service workers.
Hello, there's someone in the back.
My partner.
Yeah. A little strange drawing of Donald Trump in his swimming trunks.
In San Francisco, is this?
This is in San Francisco. I thought it was really funny. But and a banana right next to him. So I thought this was a really weird photo.
I'll say that's strange. I've never seen that particular one, although I like the murals behind it on the wall. Yeah.
Why do you think Trump was elected in the first place?
I think partly he was an opposition to Obama. I think people who were racist particularly wanted some big pushback, a guy who acted very arrogant and his racism was pretty prominent. I think that some of it was reaction, some of it was people realizing he was racist and they could be more overtly racist. I think there are a lot of white folks who were drawn to his arrogance and his outlandish statements. I think his policies on immigration are the most vehement for some people. And I think for a small percentage of white folks, they wanted a wall. They wanted immigrants kept out. Even though we are all immigrants, except for the Native Americans here, we are all immigrants. So it's astounding. This is a very fundamental, life-changing movement for many people. I think many open-minded white folks are coming to learn how incredibly racist this country has been and continues to be. It will take many, many years for us to peel back the layers of racism and inequity and provide reparations for people because it was basically hidden. The history books didn't cover it. Teachers weren't made aware of it. And so this movement is helping raise awareness and increase understanding of the deep-seated racism that permeates this country. And I think it's going to take a long time for people who have been socialized to be so racist to open their hearts and look at their forms of discrimination. It's going to take us a long while. But I do believe this movement is critical towards making that happen. My birthday was February the 2nd, and a good friend who knows that I protest and demonstrate brought me a new sign. I'm going to get it and see if I can show you just very quickly. Let's see. We believe Black Lives Matter. Love is love. Science is real.
No humans illegal. Women rights are human rights. Water is life.
Right. Yeah. So that's my next sign for my next demonstration.
That's great. I'm really also very worried about water, actually.
Yes, it's a major concern. And the United Nations Association Film Festival, which I volunteer for, has some wonderful documentary films on water. You can go to unaf.org and see these films are from all over the world. And out of the 700 films that we receive each year and have a 10-day festival, 60 or 70 films are chosen. These films are available to see online, and you can see them at certain times, but I would recommend that you take a look if you haven't seen films around the issues of climate justice and injustice. UNAFF.org. I think one thing that is important for white people to realize is the need for white folks to have ongoing self-interrogation. One workshop, one weekend is not enough. This is going to take massive re-education. Two shows that I think help white folks especially understand this, the deep and profound injuries to Black folks are on democracynow.org. Amy Goodman's December 31st, 2020 and January 1st, 2021 programs. They're hour-long programs. And for folks who think they've reached some kind of consciousness around anti-racism, it's a couple of programs that will help you understand the call for defunding and shifting money away from the police to social services. We have a long way to go in this, and any efforts to try and keep moving upward are really appreciated.
Good. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, and keep me posted.